Fat lady sings, I see the writing on the walls. I mean, back to the scene cause it was pride before the fall. And now the demons grin, there's no temptation too tall. So it's forever. Yeah, imagination that shifted realities till paradigms shift into shades you ain't never seen. Was once excited for all this, now I ain't trying to be seen. Forever. Cause this mind is straight shattered, but I can barely say something. Feel like shit don't matter.
Whew. That was quick, right? Ah, almost, man, almost. Alright, back at it, bro. Anarchism is a world. Check this. Check me out. Is a world without rulers possible? Leave your answer in the comments. Kicking it with Max Morrow currently. Let's hear more of it, my brother.
Are inseparable. But okay, let's get a little more specific.
Okay.
What exactly do anarchists oppose when it comes to the state? Well, to put it simply, the state is just one massive hierarchy. Power is centralized in the hands of a few at the very top, and they get to determine the rules and legislation which govern everybody else. At the drop of a hat, the state can limit your free speech if it's not in their interest, they can implement curfews, they can take your money and use it to fund faraway wars, and they can annihilate your right to privacy in the name of combating terrorism. For example, here in Sydney, we've recently had anti-protest laws passed after the Bondi terror attack, which have limited literally all forms of public assembly. Even if it's a protest on an issue completely unrelated to the tragedy which took place in Bondi, it's been a no-go. In fact, just the other week, a man by the name of Paul Silver planned a rally over Indigenous deaths in custody for January 18th, which is exactly 10 years after the death of his uncle. However, because of the laws in place, this demonstration was deemed illegal. The police lined up blocking the road, and they ordered the protesters to disperse for completely unjust reasons. This is the exact type of control and overreach which anarchists oppose, as it's antithetical to the rights we are entitled to as human beings. And look, it's important to note here that anarchists aren't just opposed to hyper-authoritarian regimes like North Korea and Russia. Their criticisms extend very much to liberal democracies as well. Now sure, it's definitely true that when anarchists were first writing in the 19th century, they were surrounded by tyrannical governments in the form of absolutist monarchies. There was Tsar Nicholas in Russia, there was Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, and there was even King Leopold in Belgium, whose colonial rule in the Congo killed about 10 million people. That degree of brutality and despotism was definitely front of mind as they were developing anarchist theory, but their problems with governmental hierarchy extend much further than those particularly egregious examples of state power. To quote Zoe Baker, even if a state was somehow genuinely democratic in the sense that it was one in which the majority ruled, it was still a state, and so incompatible with freedom, equality, and solidarity. All states are social structures in which those who rule have the power to impose decisions on everyone within a given territory via institutionalized methods of coercion, such as the legal system, police, prisons, and the army. The rule of the majority would, even if it was preferable.
So all of these authority officials, right? All of those are at the mercy of whoever has the most cake, whoever got the biggest freaking wallet. Fuck. Yo, that is tough news, actually. Okay, you know, we knew this and how governments be corrupt and this, that, and the third, but really they are literally at the mercy of people with a lot of money. But then if you think about it, it's like, yo, the government and the resources that it needs to function, those things need to be just like manufactured or purchased or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And obviously, the people with the most money, they the ones that like can assist the best. And like really thinking about it is just another level of hitting different, right?
To the rule of the few results in the domination of various minorities due to them being subject to this coercive power. This is a major point of criticism from the anarchist point of view, as a liberal democracy is still subject to a tyranny of the majority. I mean, think about it. Whenever there's a major federal election in your country, what does the final vote tally end up looking like? For example, if we go back to the 2024 election in the United States, you can see that Trump won 49.8% of the popular vote, whereas Kamala Harris won slightly less at just 48.3%. All things considered, that's a pretty tiny margin of victory, and it allows that 49.8% of Americans to impose their will on that slightly smaller 48.3% of Americans.
And it's damn near almost the same, but it's like, yo, just because of that little difference, right? They got a bigger dick. No, my fault.
Contrast, this is something we'll talk about more later on, anarchists subscribe to the concept of free association. When people come together to form communities and groups, it should always be based on a voluntary and mutual agreement between free equals.
Nice.
If at any point the group you're in makes a decision that you're unhappy with and you can't convince others of your point of view, then you are free to leave without the fear of punishment or the use of coercive force. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to that position, especially when you start scaling up organizations to the level of millions of people, but principally, it sits in direct opposition to the majority rule you're subject to under a liberal democracy. Also, on the topic of free association, another criticism which anarchists would levy against the state is the fact we're never really given an opportunity to formally opt into this system. Basically, because you were born into a certain geographic territory by mere circumstance, you were therefore subject to—
Hey, you were born into this life of sin. Boom! Hey, you're born a sinner. Born sinner.
the rules of whatever government has come along and claimed authority over that land.
bro.
At no point does a representative of the state come to your house and ask you a written consent to join society, to represent you with any meaningful alternatives, and that's the definition of an involuntary agreement. Your only options today are 1. Move to another nation state and subject yourself to their authority, or 2. Find an uninhabited part of the Arctic Circle where you can create a commune free of state power and either freeze to death or be mauled by a polar bear.
Nice.
It's not a consensual agreement if those are your only 2 options. Now to wrap things up here on why anarchists oppose the state, I want to take a look at one final example, which really highlights the absurdity of everything we've just discussed. Conscription. During the Vietnam War, more than 2.2 million men who were lucky enough to be born into the geographic territory known as the United States were forced to go and fight in a war against another geographic territory over 10,000.
Did you just say who were lucky enough to be born into the United States got chosen to go fight in a war? Wait, what part of that is luck?
Kilometers away who posed no threat but subscribed to a different ideology. Then, over the course of that conflict, which lasted 2 decades, 60,000 of those men were killed, 150,000 were injured, and countless more suffered from PTSD. And, to top it all off, if you did the same thing and refused to serve your military because it was a bullshit war, you could go to prison and be stripped of all your freedoms anyway. This is obviously an extreme example, but it illustrates perfectly why anarchists are so opposed to the idea of a state. Through the threat of coercion, a handful of powerful elites in government can dictate the terms of your life, they can send you to go and die in a war you want nothing to do with, and they can strip you of your freedoms at a moment's notice because that's just how it is. You reside in that territory and you are therefore subject to whatever that government decides. To an anarchist who believes in the absolute freedom of all human beings, this idea is simply untenable. So, with the state out the way, I think it's time we move to the slightly more controversial system which anarchists oppose.
What's that?
Capitalism. Now, to make things abundantly clear, because I don't want to leave any room for confusion, all anarchists, no matter what flavor they happen to be, are strictly anti-capitalist, aka they are socialists. They do not like capitalism in a house, and they do not like capitalism with a mouse. Now you might be wondering to yourself, oh, what about anarcho-capitalists? They've literally got it in their name. And don't worry, my dear fledgling, we'll get to those creatures in due course. So yeah, when it comes to the very broad category of socialism, anarchists represent the libertarian wing of the movement, you got some Marxists in the middle who are a little more pro-state, and then you got your wacky authoritarian Stalinists and Maoists all the way on the other side. I'm definitely being a little reductive here, but that's just to paint a general picture. But okay, that begs the question. Why are anarchists opposed to capitalism? Well, to understand why, I think it's important that we visit the context in which early anarchists were writing, because capitalism, well, it was a bit more of a brutal beast back then. This is something I genuinely don't think enough people know about today, because holy fuck, the beginning of capitalism marked a significant regression in living standards for the average person. To quote Rudolf Rocker, the enormous majority of the workers dwelt in miserable, dirty holes without even a glass window. They had to spend from 14 to 15 hours a day in the sweatshops of industry, innocent of either hygienic equipment or provision for the protection of the lives and health of the inmates. I mean, hell, just take a look at England, where the average life expectancy went from 43 in the 1500s to the low 30s in the 1700s. Additionally, worker rights were non-existent, child labor was the norm, and despite the fact workers were having their limbs crushed off by heavy machinery in unsafe factories, they were being paid fuck all for their troubles. Life was truly abysmal in the 18th and 19th centuries, and these were the conditions which inspired the emergence of anti-capitalist movements. Fortunately for us though, times have changed, and now we just ship all that soul-crushing and debilitating labor to the developing world so they can do it instead. You know, out of sight, out of mind. So, whilst on one hand you had the working class toiling away in a factory for 14 hours a day, grinding themselves to a dust, you also had a small portion of owners getting extremely rich off this arrangement without having to break a sweat. And this brings us to Socialism 101. To truly understand how workers are exploited in the creation of profit, let's take a look at a more modern example. If you were paid $10 per hour by McDonald's to flip burgers, for you to be of any worth to the company, you would have to necessarily produce more value than what you're paid in wages. If I had to hazard a guess, you're probably creating something like $30 worth of value per hour, yet you're only receiving a small portion back in wages. Now sure, McDonald's does have to pay for a lot of stuff, which you don't have to worry about as a worker. They buy the meat patties you're flipping, they pay for the maintenance on the stovetops, they pay for the electricity bills which keep the lights on, and there's a whole host of other things which they have to—
They got the budget for that shit. They got the budget for that. You know what I'm saying? It's not like before I applied for the job, they ain't had all that. They had all that. Alright, but let me let you finish, man. But it is fucked up though.
Account for as well. So, to drastically simplify things, of that $30 worth of value you've created, $10 goes back to you in wages, another $10 goes to all those costs we just talked about, and then that leaves us with $10 remaining. So, as I'm sure you're on the edge of your seat wondering, who gets that remaining money? Well, to borrow some Marxian terminology, that final $10 is what we call surplus value, and it goes to whoever owns the McDonald's in the form of profit. Although it was your labor which created all that value in the first place, you only get a sliver of it back in return, and this is what anarchists have a major problem with. In fact, it's from this concept that you find one of Proudhon's most famous quotes, property is theft. Now, just to be clear, when Proudhon uses the word property here, he's not referring to personal property like your toothbrush or the clothes you wear, he's referring to something known as private property. This refers to the type of stuff you can own and use to generate an income. For example, if you own an apartment, you can find a tenant and earn income when they pay you rent. If you have
basically your assets, right? At this point.
Have a shit ton of money lying around, you can lend it out to people and earn an income when they pay you interest. And as we talked about with McDonald's before, if you own a business, you can earn an income through the profits it generates. Now, from the anarchist perspective, all of these forms of private property basically equate to a legalized form of robbery. Because you as a worker don't own any private property and you need money to, well, survive, that means you are forced to sell your labor to somebody who does own a business. Then, by virtue of that ownership, they are permitted to extract all the surplus value which you create in the form of profit, and you just kind of have to go along with this arrangement unless you want to be starving on the street. And it ties into what we were talking about earlier, the state legitimizes this whole arrangement. Property rights are enshrined into law, the courts uphold it, and the police are tasked with enforcing it. Now, this capitalist organization of the economy creates a pretty clear hierarchy in which there are two distinct classes of people. To borrow the words of Emma Goldman, there are those who always work but never have anything.
Oh yeah, that's probably where the division of the classes came through, right? Because obviously now if you have that class of people that are providing, that are supplying the resources, where workforce is required for that resource to be worked, and so that so that society can like go ahead and consume whatever it is they consume. It's like those, you know what I'm saying, those people pocket all the profits, and then the class of people that get like the what did he call it, the slithers, the crumbs, the bits, that's like the lower class, like after that high class, right? The middle class, goddamn it. That's the middle class. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's what we about to break down next, bro. Let me see that.
And those who never work but enjoy everything. For the owning class, the accumulation of wealth and private property generates them an income without the need to labor, and, going back to our core principles of anarchism, this creates a highly unequal society in which true freedom is restricted to those who own everything. Especially back in those early days of capitalism, if you happen to be a worker who is spending 14 hours in a factory and barely being paid enough to survive, you're not really being presented an opportunity to freely develop yourself. The only creativity you got to exercise as a working class person back in the day was, I don't know, how much sawdust you can add to your bread though before your family notices that it tastes kind of weird. Now, it isn't just the fact that workers don't receive the full value of their labor under capitalism, which anarchists oppose. Perhaps more importantly, it's also the nature of the work we're doing, because, well, it's kind of awful. No matter where you happen to reside on the political spectrum, I think you'd agree that a lot of the jobs people are doing today are pretty unfulfilling, to say the least. Most people are stuck in middle management in some faceless corporation, or they're doing data entry or administration or some other completely intangible and abstract thing like filling out spreadsheets or sorting emails or whatever to that effect. I don't think it's a coincidence that the vast majority of people report being emotionally detached at work, if not outright miserable, and it's only getting worse. And I mean, hell, if you think that we have it bad today, just think back to those poor bastards who were around when the anarchists were first writing. Guided by the profit motive, factory owners were incentivized to make their manufacturing process as efficient as possible so they could maximize how much they produced and therefore could
Look at the children working these factories, bro. Little kids.
sell. The most famous example of this in action, which came along a little later in the 1900s, was Fordism, the manufacturing process developed by Henry Ford to create a shit ton of cars for his motor company, Ford. By breaking down the complex production of a car into small, simple, and repetitive tasks, which a worker can repeat all day, shit gets extremely efficient. I mean, hell, thanks to the innovation of the moving assembly line, workers didn't even need to move their legs because that would be a waste of time. And look, this is all great if you're trying to maximize profits, and there's no doubt that we owe a lot of our material living conditions today to the division of labor. However, this arrangement isn't so good if you're the poor worker standing in the same spot for 12 hours straight, repeating the same task thousands of times, only getting 1 day off per week for the entirety of your existence. existence. This is a problem that the forefather of capitalism, Adam Smith, was aware of when it came to the division of labor, warning, the man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too are perhaps always the same or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Do you remember that whole thing about—
Now imagine what that does to you as the individual, though. You know what I'm saying? It makes you stupid to even your own, you know what I'm saying? Like what you can tap into in terms of your own potential, bro. Because obviously now they suck all that energy of you gotta be at the factories, you gotta be at the work spots, you know what I'm saying? You gotta, and look, when I feel like when this whole system was implemented, right? It was a whole revolution. Things were changing. People were experiencing a whole new possibility of how life is becoming. You know what I'm saying? Until, you know, the Great Awakening. Like, what else could we call it? Until the Great Awakening, where, like, from my perspective, right, it's much more of a crime, you know, to humanity when we consider the fact that you cannot even, you know, express your own self. You cannot tap into your own identity and its full potential is my whole thing. You know what I'm saying? Because your whole focus, your whole attention, your whole energy, blood, sweat, and tears is sucked out by, right, the labor that is demanded of you. You feel what I'm saying?
about positive liberty and freely developing the best version of yourself, which anarchists were rambling about. Well, yeah, I'm not really sure if being as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become is all that conducive to personal development. To borrow the words of Emma Goldman, this type of monotonous and mind-numbing labor treats workers as a mere particle of a machine with less will and decision than his master of steel and iron. And look, you could talk about anarchist critiques of capitalism until the fucking cows come home, but I'll limit it to one final point. When you're at work, you don't have an opportunity to exercise your autonomy in the production process. Once you've signed that contract and agreed to work for a certain company, you kind of just got to do what they say if you want to earn a living. Now sure, there's a limit to what they can ask you to do because some labor laws exist, but you're still subject to a strict chain of command where you're given orders and that's that. And look, whilst my experience in the workplace is rather limited due to my rather unconventional career path, talking worker autonomy reminds me of a story which my girlfriend told me about her job. Basically, she works for one of the big supermarket chains in Australia.
And not to mention, bro, like I feel like I've shared this in one of my other channels, right? The fact that, bro, once you're at work and then you are, you know, subject to that whole system of how, you know, you function during those hours that you're clocked into work, right? It's like there's aspects of you that you literally have to neglect, right? And that's the emotional aspects where, you know, you can have, like, you don't just act off the cuff, you don't just act emotional when you're at work, right? It's everything is systematized. You're there, you do what you're supposed to do there, you know what I'm saying? Specifically at whatever specific time, you know what I mean? You're in customer service, customer cusses your ass off, you know what I'm saying? Like, you got no other option but to suck it up, you know what I mean? You know that whole saying, the customer is always right. The customer always wins. Like, bullshit, you know what I'm saying? You gotta suck it all up. You work with colleagues that are just like unhinged, like animals of human, right? Animals. It's like, damn, bro. And you know, you get one of those days where they just disturb your soul, bruh. You just gotta suck it up, or you run the risk of like making a mistake, you know what I'm saying, having an emotional explosion, and then now it's like, yo, you gotta get dismissed. I'm not gonna lie, I'm talking from experience, bruh. It's crazy. Talking from experience. So, and what that has taught me, you know what I'm saying, is the fact that to a certain extent, bro, you gotta neglect a very important aspect of you, a very significant aspect of yourself, bro. I'd say the emotional. You know what I mean? Leave it in the comments what you think is neglected when, you know, you integrate, you know, into the workforce and just get a 9 to 5, right? and function how you're supposed to function in a 9 to 5.
And a couple months ago, they asked all their employees to fill out a survey. Now, my girlfriend actually had some feedback to give because they'd recently implemented this bullshit procedure where employees had to spend at least 30 seconds with customers if they experienced an issue during checkout. It didn't matter if it was a relatively simple problem to fix that only took a couple seconds and didn't need an explanation. They were forced to spend half a minute with the customer, and they were surveilled by management to make sure they reached this arbitrary threshold. To quote directly from the feedback which my girlfriend gave them, this system forces many of us to pretend to be stupid, over-explain simple issues, and being instructed to work slowly to ensure we meet the allocated time frame, in turn intentionally wasting the customer's time and causing them frustration, which is often verbally taken out on us.
Hey, and y'all know them customers, bruh. Yo, customers, bruh. Damn, that's a different type of animal. Customer is a different type of animal, my boy. You feel me? Oh man, damn, is there any like customer, you know, like a job where you deal with customers, right? And then the customer doesn't have this this right, quote unquote right, this right where they're right. They're always right. It's like they're the ones, you know, their word is taken as top priority, da da da. And I get the fact that, you know, it's because of them that the business runs. It's because of them that, you know, people can get paid, like workers can get paid there. It's because of them and shit like that. But like, don't be a freaking dick. Don't be a dickhead about it. You know what I'm saying? I feel like that's the whole point of it. Like at the end of the day, you see what I'm saying? Because you do get human beings that like just like take that side out of you, bro. Like, we talking about customers? Damn.
Already, you can probably see that we're dealing with an awful system implemented by some out-of-touch higher-up who has no idea what it's like to work on the ground, but the story doesn't end there. When my girlfriend actually took the time to write that detailed feedback on this procedure, she was immediately ostracized by management and treated weirdly for doing, well, exactly what they asked them to do. All her fellow employees simply zoomed through the survey without providing any specific feedback, but when she actually wanted to help speed things up and make things run more smoothly, which would also help the company's bottom line, she was given the cold shoulder. That minute degree of autonomy afforded to her in the form of a survey ultimately amounted to nothing, and it's this hierarchical structure in which a worker has no say and no input in the labor they're doing, which anarchists vehemently oppose. To once again quote Chomsky, a frequency which I'm sure all the real anarchists are loving, it's ridiculous to talk about freedom in a society dominated by huge corporations. What kind of freedom is there inside a corporation? They're totalitarian institutions. You take orders from above and maybe give them to people below you. That's about as much freedom as under Stalinism. Chomsky said that back in the 1980s, and now, with the rise of surveillance and AI monitoring to ensure workers aren't procrastinating, his point is more relevant than ever.